Welcome to this video on the Contax G2 camera. The Contax G2 was an automatic exposure electronic rangefinder camera using aperture priority automatic exposure with manual override. It was aimed at the advanced amateur market. It is an autofocus camera that uses centre-weighted metering. It takes lenses of the Contax G line and can use all of the lenses of the Contax G line. The G2 was the second and last model of the Contax G line and superseded the G1. The Contax G2 has a single central autofocus point. Introduced in 1996, the camera has built-in motor drive for film advance and rewind. The film speed range is 6 to 6400 ASA in 1/3 of a stop increments, and also DX coding support over the range of 25 to 5000 ASA. Metering is centre-weighted only. The range of shutter speeds is from 1 second to 1/4000th of a second in manual mode, and from 16 seconds to 1/6000th of a second in aperture priority automatic mode. The shutter speeds are stepless. Shutter flash sync is 1/200th of a second. An electronic cable release can be attached to a custom socket. Multiple exposures are supported. Exposure compensation of plus or minus 2 stops is available in 1/3 of a stop increments. TTL flash with Contax flash units is supported. Automatic exposure bracketing is available up to plus or minus 1 stop in 1/2 stop increments. The main controls on the Contax G2 are the on-off switch, which also incorporates the AE lock and shutter release, the exposure counter panel, the shutter speed wheel and auto manual exposure mode selector, the ABC mode lever, the exposure compensation dial, the flash hot shoe with TTL connector pins, the display panel with the camera and drive mode indications, and optionally an indication of whether the camera is using DX film speed reading, and a low battery stay indication. The subject distance as detected by the autofocus system is also displayed. The ISO button and the drive mode selection wheel. On the back of the camera are the focusing mode selector wheel and focus lock button. The viewfinder cover and diopter wheel. On the front of the camera are the lens release at the side of the lens mount, the electronic self-timer LED, and the manual focus wheel, the PC sync port, and the film backdoor release catch, and the manual film rewind button, the electronic cable release socket. On the bottom of the camera is a tripod socket, and the battery compartment that takes 2 CR2 batteries. The main power switch has a shutter release in the middle of it. The power switch goes from off to on to AEL for auto exposure lock, which saves the current metered shutter speed value. The shutter speed is set by rotating the combined exposure mode selector shutter speed wheel from auto to one of the shutter speed values. The release button in the centre of the dial needs to be pressed to rotate from the auto or B settings. The film speed setting can either be set to DX for auto film speed setting with DX coded films, or manually. The film speed can be set manually by holding down the ISO button with the camera switched on until the displayed film speed value starts blinking. The film speed can then be changed by rotating the focus dial on the front of the camera. When the desired film speed has been selected, turn off the camera to save the value. DX mode can also be selected using this method. In automatic exposure mode, exposure compensation is set by rotating the exposure compensation dial. Compensation range is plus or minus 2 stops in 1/3 of a stop increments. The film rewinds automatically when the end of the film is reached. It can be rewound partway through the film using the manual rewind button on the side of the camera. The camera is switched between auto and manual focus by rotating the focus mode selection ring. There are 2 AF modes, CAF for continuous autofocus and SAF for single autofocus, and a manual focus mode, MF. In manual focus mode, the focusing distance is set by rotating the manual focus dial on the front of the camera. The display in the viewfinder shows when the focus distance set matches the distance to the subject in the focus frame of the viewfinder. The viewfinder display shows a number of bars to the left or right of the centre of the focus scale to indicate front or back focus. When only one bar is showing, the focus is correct. The autofocus system behaves differently between CAF and SAF modes. The camera supports auto, i.e. aperture priority automatic exposure mode, where the aperture is set on the lens and the camera sets the shutter speed. There is also manual exposure mode, where you set both the aperture and the shutter speed, and B for long exposures and X for flash sync. The modes are selected by pushing in the release button on the combined exposure mode selector shutter speed wheel and selecting one of the shutter speeds or the exposure modes. The drive mode wheel enables the selection of single frame advance, low 2 frames per second or high 4 frames per second continuous frame advance, a self timer or multiple exposure mode. Rotate the wheel to select the desired mode. The diopter lens can be adjusted using the diopter wheel. The ABC mode enables a series of 3 exposures to be taken, one at the set exposure value and one each above and below the metered value at the exposure bracket value. The bracket value is set using the ABC mode selector dial. 3 frames at 0.5 stops bracket. Three frames at 1 stop bracket. Cable release socket is used to connect a Contax electronic cable release and all the compatible accessories. The Contax G2 uses the Contax cable release S or cable release L type cable releases. Setting multiple exposure mode enables multiple exposures to be taken on the same frame. The first frame will have the multi-exposure indicator flashing in the LED screen, and when the first frame is exposed, the multi-exposure indicator will be on in the LED screen. Setting the drive mode back to S enables the second frame to be taken. If more than 2 exposures are required to be exposed on the same frame, then having set the drive mode back to S for the second frame, set the drive mode back to multi-exposure before pressing the shutter release, and repeat this the required number of times. There is a PC sync port for use with a flash that does not use a hot shoe. You have to ensure that the shutter speed is 1/200th of a second or lower. The camera supports TTL flash metering with Contax flashes. The G2 is compatible with later Contax flashes in TTL mode, although it will not support all of the features of the TLA 360, although second curtain sync is supported. A flash can be connected either using the PC sync port or the hot shoe. TTL flash only works via the hot shoe connection. In automatic mode with the Contax flash attached that supports TTL metering, the camera automatically switches to 1/200th of a second flash sync speed. Sometimes a lower flash sync speed is set depending on the camera mode. The viewfinder illustration from the brochure is shown here. The viewfinder displays the shutter speed with over and under exposure indications. There is also an indication of when exposure compensation is used, and a flash ready indication which also doubles as a flash exposure confidence indication. In autofocus mode, the distance to the subject is also displayed in the viewfinder. If the focus distance cannot be determined, the viewfinder shows marks at either end of the viewfinder scale. In manual focus mode, the viewfinder shows the focal deviation as a bar, indicating either front or back focus, and the correct focus is determined by altering the focus to reduce the width of the bar to a minimum. The viewfinder zooms to show the correct angle of view with the 28mm, 35mm, 45mm, 90mm and 35 to 70mm zoom lenses, and incorporates parallax correction. The 16 and 21mm lenses have external viewfinders that are fitted to the hot shoe on the camera. The built-in viewfinder is not that bright and can flare badly, causing the viewfinder display to be difficult to read. The G-series lenses were optimised for use on a rangefinder system, and lack the extra optics required for mirror clearance used for lenses on an SLR. This resulted in an increase in quality in some of the lenses, as the wide-angle lenses can use different designs that protrude back into the body of the camera, such as the biagon and hologon, in place of the distagon used on the SLR designs. The layout of the planar design is also different from the SLR planars. The 90mm sonar design seems unaffected, and its performance seems very similar to the sonar design used in the SLRs for the 85mm f2.8. The G lenses were introduced in two stages, but all of them work on the G2. The 35 to 70mm zoom only works on the G2, and will not work on the G1. It is optimised for the G2 with rear elements that protrude back into the camera body. All of the lenses in the range, with the exception of the 16mm f8 hologon, are autofocus. The 16mm f8 hologon is manual focus, and its operation on the camera is rather different to the other lenses. There was an adapter produced for mounting the Contax G2 range of SLR lenses on the G-series cameras. It has some preset focal lengths that were used to set the viewfinder on the camera to the correct angle of view. The lenses need to be manually focused using the focusing ring on the lens, although with some of them, the rangefinder could be used to get the focusing distance to set. There can be issues with some lenses with too wide a front element when using the rangefinder to focus, and only some of the Contax G2 lenses can be supported by the viewfinder zoom. The camera has a 10-second self-timer. The LED on the front will blink while the self-timer is operating. The 21mm biagon and 16mm hologon lenses both have external viewfinders that are attached to the camera's hot shoe. These lenses are too wide an angle of view for the built-in viewfinder to show the correct field of view. When using these lenses, the camera is typically focused using the built-in viewfinder, and the focus then locked and the image reframed by switching to the external viewfinder and reframing while holding the autofocus. The 16mm hologon is a manual focus lens, so there is no need to lock the focus when using this lens. Mounting the external viewfinder on the hot shoe prevents the camera's TTL flash metering being used. But as the flash will probably not cover the angle of view of these lenses, this is not much of a problem in practice. When using these lenses, there is no parallax correction carried out in the viewfinder, unlike with the other lenses. The external viewfinders are brighter than the internal one. The viewfinder for the 21mm biagon has a centre mark, indicator cross. The 16mm hologon is unique in the lens range in being a manual focus lens, with a fixed aperture, a separate light metering system and no TTL flash support. Using the camera with this lens is a different experience. The lens has two focusing scales, one in metres on the outside of the lens and a second in feet on the inside of the lens mount front. Depth of field scales are supplied for both. A separate viewfinder is used that is mounted on the hot shoe. The camera's autofocus system can be used to determine the distance to the selected subject, and the distance determined then set on the lens using the focusing scales on the lens. Alternatively, the distance to the subject can be estimated and then set on the lens. The lens uses a fixed aperture of f8, and a separate metering system on the front of the camera is used when this lens is mounted on the camera. This is not a TTL metering system like the one used with the other lenses. The external metering with this lens only has a 40-degree angle of coverage, a lot less than 106 degrees over the lens. The external light meter EV range is slightly expanded over that of the Contax G1. The lens is supplied with an anti-vignetting filter. When using this filter, be sure to allow an extra 2 stops of exposure to allow for the filter, by using the exposure compensation in auto mode or using the shutter speed in manual mode. The external viewfinder has a level indicator consisting of a bubble of liquid viewed through a slot at the bottom of the viewfinder eyepiece. The lens is expensive on the second-hand market. There were 2 flashes made for the Contax G series cameras, the TLA 140 shown here and the later TLA 200. Both of these are very expensive for what they are. The Contax SLR flashes also work with the G series cameras in TTL mode and tend to be much cheaper, and some offer much more functionality. There is also a data pack for the G2 and filters and lens hoods, and an adapter for an external power pack. The camera also has custom functions. See the manual for more details. The autofocus of the G2 is a vast improvement on that of the G1, due to the upgrading of the AF assist light in the G1 to a full active autofocus system. The autofocus is also faster than on the G1. In single-shot drive mode, the camera will not fire if it has not been able to focus. Manual focus is different from on the G1, as the focus distance is set using the dial on the front of the camera. You can still check the indicated focus distance against an estimated distance as a check. In continuous drive mode, the camera will always fire the shutter, whether in focus or not, and you have to monitor the focus display in the viewfinder to check whether the subject is in focus or not before shooting. I have seen the autofocus fail to find the correct focus in heavy backlighting. The focus and exposure lock using a half press of the shutter release can be problematic when using a cable release. The camera drive mode wheel is also capable of being accidentally adjusted to the wrong modes if you're not careful handling the camera or storing it in the bag. The Contax G2 is a bit of a schizophrenic camera, trying to be both a lightweight autofocus system camera with auto exposure and flash support, and also a no compromises image quality camera. It works as a no compromises image quality camera because of the quality of the lenses, although the range of lenses is restrictive and you do lose a lot of ease of use with some of them. The main problem is the practical necessity of using a tripod for optimal quality, and the price tag of the camera is in the range of medium format film cameras, so they tend to be its competition in the high image quality scenario. And for a lot of uses, the medium format cameras make more sense. As a lightweight autofocus system, the camera's main problem are its restricted lens range and its price. The lens range is mainly wide angles of excellent quality, although with only one standard lens, one mid-range zoom and one short telephoto, and no lenses faster than f2, there are quite a lot of fields that the camera is not very well suited to. No very shallow depth of field for portraiture, no work requiring even moderately long telephoto lenses. Also, the autofocus only has a single autofocus point, which is a bit limiting for the price tag of the G2. There are likely to be a lot of alternatives that support multiple autofocus points and a wider range of lenses suited for a wider range of work, mainly SLRs. As a rangefinder camera, you get autofocus and a zooming viewfinder with parallax collection for most of the lenses. A high maximum shutter speed and TTL flash metering with up to 1/200th of a second flash sync speed, at least with all of the lenses except the 16mm f8 hologon. The 16mm hologon is a peculiar lens for the G system cameras, as the cameras could be simpler if they didn't have to support it, as no second light meter system would be required, and using it is a different experience to using every other lens in the system. The camera is well built with a solid feel and is easy to use in most cases. The G series of flashes are overpriced on the second-hand market, and the cost of the camera and the unavailability of repairs makes it a risky purchase. The improved autofocus performance makes the G2 a significant improvement on the G1, but at a much higher price. I have attached some pictures that I have taken on my G2 to the end of the video.